This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Bareboat Alaska. Up your DIY hunting game with one of their 37-foot adventure yachts. You and 5 of your friends can hunt, fish, set crab pots, shrimp pots, and take DIY to the next level. Bareboat Alaska is locally owned by a Ketchikan resident who lives here year-round. Call Larry at 907-617-4542 or go to bareboatalaska.com. That's B-A-R-E boatalaska.com and tell Larry you heard about it on this podcast. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Will Collins, the Buffalo roamer, who I just discovered that it works on 2 different levels. It is as a graduate from the University of Colorado. Wait, is it Colorado University or University of Colorado?
University of Colorado, funny enough, but they go by CU.
Okay, yeah. And then you roam, kind of like the Buffalo, except you like to row by canoe, which also
exactly. It works on different levels. And when I was first coming up with the name, that's my website and blog and kind of podcast, obviously, and kind of moniker. It was just one of those things where, I'm a Buffalo. I'm a big University of Colorado and Buffalo guy. I roam, and one of my buddies was like, "Hey, what about Buffalo Roamer?" And I was like, "Huh, that's pretty. That's unique. It's different than Will Collins. Something to remember." So it kind of stuck, and I've been going with it since.
Yeah, I came up with the mediocre Alaskan because I didn't want to be one of those people who pretends to be a professional or an expert. But now I wonder if it works against me because people think that it's either a bunch of mediocre content, mediocre guests, and I don't know anything. So I don't know. I think
like it.
It's kind of clever, but when you look at marketability and stickability, I don't know if it's the best thing. But at this point, I'm not going to change it.
For what it's worth, which probably isn't much, I like it, and I like the whole, the whole idea behind it as well, because I think you and I, only talking for a little bit, but I've since read some of your stuff. I think we have similar thought processes on that. Whereas, and the more I come to think about it, it's like the more human people are and the more humility and like accepting and open of failures and like not being the biggest, baddest, mountain climber or hunter or canoeist or whatever. It's like, we just go out, we do these things because it's meaningful and we enjoy doing it, and we mess up, but we try and do the best we can.
Yeah, I think it appeals to a lot of people. That was why I went with it. But there's also that, you don't want to live a mediocre life, but I don't think I have a mediocre life. I think I have a good life. I think I'm competent enough in these areas to be able to write, to be able to hike and hunt and fish and do that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's messaging is interesting. Have you found that there's been some things when you're marketing your podcast and selling your canoe trips that you just get, I don't know, that just overwhelmed by how are you going to connect with people who are going to listen or are going to book?
Oh yeah. That's always, as much as you want to admit it or not, that's always in the back of your mind, is like, is this going to work, or am I going to reach people? What is the, if you want to use customer base loosely, because most of the stuff that I do is just, me putting it out there. And you mentioned the trips. I've organized a few trips that basically it's just people have been reaching out to me saying, hey, you do these cool trips. I'd like to do something along those lines. So it's all pretty organic, honestly. And I haven't done any advertising or anything like that for the podcast. So most of it's been organic, and it's just kind of putting stuff out there, honestly, because it's something that I'm passionate about. And I enjoy talking with people who have a similar interest. I enjoy sharing stories and hearing other people's perspective. It's fun to talk to you like this on the other side of the podcasting seat, I guess, or screen, however you want to put it, because I get to share my story. But really, I like hearing other people's stories because I know what I've done, and I find it more interesting to talk to Jeff Lund and hear about, hunting Prince of Wales or whatever, or Ketchikan or whatever it might be, So I guess I just put the stuff out there because I like doing it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing. If you get too worried about scaling and things like that too quickly, I think you just kind of lose like who you are. You got to kind of get through it and figure things out. And if you do happen to have some very interesting guests who have crazy stories or have a name as a hunter, hiker, outdoors, or content maker, if you end up asking them the exact same questions that the 50 podcast hosts before have asked, then you're just redundant. You're just doing the same thing. So it's pretty fun. Like you said, if at the core you enjoy it, that's, I think, is going to come through in what you do. And that's whether that's guiding, the podcasting, writing, teaching, doesn't matter. But
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. And I've been trying to harness that more recently and kind of take that to heart, because it is easy. You do want to reach people and you want to grow and you want to have stuff that's meaningful to people. And especially I worked in radio for a while before I did the podcast. And before I did all kinds of stuff, but I worked in radio for 6 years and studied journalism. And especially in radio and podcasting is the same thing, is that you don't always get the gratification of, and I'm sure writing obviously the same way, you don't always get the gratification of knowing the people that you've interacted with. Like, a musician goes out, it's like, okay, I had a good show, there's 100 people there, or I had I sold out Madison Square Garden, or whatever it is. But for putting out a podcast, you see the numbers that people download, but it's not as easy to connect to the audience sometimes.
yeah, it's funny. You look at the analytics, and all of a sudden you see that someone in Kenya listened. You're just like, Kenya, really? Like, is that
It's
real? Like,
crazy.
what's going on there? One of the first letters I ever got from a magazine article I wrote was from a dude who was in prison, and I just thought,
Really?
whoa. It was an article for Alaska Magazine, and it was about the people who cut the fish, because everyone goes up there and they talk about the lodge they stayed at or their own experience. But I wrote a little feature on the people who cut the fish, just a local angle. And dude in prison in California, they had a subscription, I guess, to Alaska Magazine, and he took the time to write a letter. And I thought, whoa, just of all the
Yeah.
people, who were listening or sorry, reading, but then for that person to take the time and send it, I thought that was really, really cool. But you just never know. You never know who's listening, and it's a pretty cool thing to think about sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. And it is nice when it comes around, because it seems like it always comes around in like odd times when I'm like in a lull, or I'm like questioning things. And then all of a sudden, yeah, like I've had a listener of the podcast who, again, I've never advertised the podcast. I've never done anything really other than publish it. And a random guy found the podcast, as many hundreds and I guess thousands I can say have, and downloaded it, and then was so inspired by some of the conversations and such that he did a huge adventure of his own and paddled the Mississippi River. And I actually ended up meeting him on the river and camped with him and his crew for a day. So it all came full circle. That was pretty cool. And yeah, sometimes I have to sit back and realize that it is affecting people, or at least people take enjoyment in it. So that's good.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that a little bit. You've canoed the Grand Canyon. You've canoed the Mississippi River from the headwaters all the way through, and you've also canoed the Yukon River. That's a lot to do in a lifetime. And by canoe just seems absolutely ridiculous, because if I'm a mediocre whatever at some things, as I get better, as I'm learning, canoeing is not at all something I'm very comfortable with. So I don't know, pick one of those adventures and tell me about it. Actually, tell me about the Grand Canyon.
Sure, the Grand Canyon. And the funny thing about all those trips, as you say, like in a lifetime, it's a lot. It was, for me, it was all packed in. So I did the Mississippi River, which was 103 days, the summer of 2017. And then I did the Yukon the following summer, the 2018. And then I did the Grand Canyon in that fall. I believe it would have been the fall of 2018. So it was like a lot of days on some amazing rivers in North America during that, calendar year, but like 2-year window. And that was just like changing jobs and just making it happen, really. But the Grand Canyon was one of the awesome, most cool and surprising experiences out of all of those trips. It was amazing. I had just come off the Yukon, and the Grand Canyon was a little bit different than the other trips. It was a like a self guided, I guess, self hosted trip, but it's a group trip, so you have to have a permit to get it. And one of my buddies had pulled a permit 2 years earlier, so it had been in the works for 2 years. And I want to say there was 16 of us, and it was a rafting, not canoeing, but rafting.
Good.
And the whitewater, absolutely insane. The beauty of the Grand Canyon, absolutely unparalleled in my mind, from the stuff that I've seen. Just epic proportions, amazing, even considering stuff in the Brooks Range and the Yukon and all that. Just amazing. But the cool part about the Grand Canyon, at least for me, the most unique part was after coming off the Yukon, where it was just me and one other buddy for 70 days, and the Mississippi was solo for 100 days, having a group of 16 people together for, I think it was like 24 or 30 days, something like that, for the Grand Canyon was awesome, because it's just like a whole different realm, I guess, with having that many people. Like, everyone has a good time, takes care of each other, has their roles. Like, you form such good bonds with these people on the river. That aspect of it was really cool.
Well, the Grand Canyon is such a massive. I've flown over a couple times. I've never been down inside there. I've been on the rim once, but just flown over it, and it's you can't fathom it. It's way too big, and I can't imagine being the first guy. Was it John Wesley Powell was the first guy who went through there, and he was hired by the government to just kind of go through, seeing what was going on there. The dude lost an arm in the Civil War. So the first guy who's going through there is a one-armed guy with his crew, and like two of the guys or three of the guys, when they were days from getting out, they said that we've had enough. Like, we're done with this. And so they tried to hike out and to the rim to get up out of there, because you're locked in there. And they ended up never being found. Like, they were apparently murdered by someone. This was 1870s or something like that, but just absolutely crazy to read about that.
Yeah, it's insane, man. The history of that. And also, like, you totally feel that. It's kind of an odd parallel, but my girlfriend's from Boston, and so we go back to Boston every once in a while. And when I'm in Boston, like, I can feel the history of the Revolutionary War. I don't know if you've ever been there.
Yeah, twice.
Okay, so I assume you kind of have a grasp of that. It's like, it feels old. Like, Paul Revere was sitting over here, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were, having beers in this bar over here. Shots were fired here. You can feel the revolution, like, in the city, the same way you can feel like the history of the West and like the Grand Canyon, and like the native versus Western cultures, and the history of conservation, with dams being built on the Colorado and reservoirs, and the Grand Canyon being one of the last stalwarts, or whatever you might say, that didn't get dammed. And you could just feel all of that as you're floating through this like epically magnificent place, with like, pooping your pants because the whitewater is so big and massive and cold. And yeah, it's cool seeing all of the ancestral homes and like grain storage centers built into the side of the canyon as you go.
That had to be, like, of those three, that one was probably the least touched, because there were you saw some communities along the way in the Yukon, evidence of humans, not much, but along the way you see some evidence of that. Obviously, the Mississippi is just totally. I would think the whole thing would just be lined with evidence of humans and trash and just brownness. So let's go to the Mississippi now. Like, what was that like?
Well, you're giving it a terrible rap, man. It is one of the most
I'm just going by
beautiful
stereotypes,
rivers.
man.
Oh, I know. No worries. I think it's the most underappreciated asset of our country for sure, man. It is awesome. It is I'm still in love with it, as you can tell. I live like an hour and a half from it now. I bounced around a bit, but and I try and get out there whenever I can. But it's amazing. It's just like a big, massive river. And it's interesting what you said about like the Grand Canyon versus the Mississippi and the Yukon. Like the Grand Canyon is very, it's a national park, but with that, there's however many trips that go down there. There's a few trips that leave a day off of there. So there's a lot of people that float through there. And while it's pristine, it's a little bit different. I honestly feel like some of the sections of the Mississippi, like as you get the lower Mississippi in some of these rural parts of the South, it is raw and remote, especially within the river, because there's not that many people that recreate on it. The barges are rocking and rolling, but it's pretty wild out there. And the levees are built up in the lower part of the Mississippi. So all the towns sit back behind the levees. So there's not really that much action on the river, and it feels really, really raw. Now, once you get out of that bank, you walk to town.
Yeah.
But within those confines, it is pretty wild.
I don't know if I was surprised because I knew that Arkansas was kind of what it was, but I drove with my brother from North Carolina to California, and we stopped and we fished the White River in Arkansas, and it was beautiful. And when we were crossing over the Mississippi, it was a massive hunk of water, but it is not the stereotype. I kind of over exaggerate a little bit there, but
no, that's okay.
Beautiful areas.
You're not alone, and it's just a passion of mine. So I like talking about it because it's like it is so underappreciated. You think of like, people call it the big ditch or like pollution, and there is all kinds of problems with it. There is a lot of pollution. All these huge cities and commerce have their effects for sure. But I think it's also cool because you get a mix of wilderness, but also like a history, like the fabric of America. Like America was founded on, for instance, New Orleans was founded in like 1600 on the Mississippi by the, what was it, Spanish or French. And it's just, there's just so much history, American history in particular, driven through the Mississippi.
Yeah. So if we look at the lower Mississippi as kind of Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, what states are kind of the middle? And then when do things go from kind of, I don't know, maybe more pristine, like the upper versus the middle versus the lower? How does that work?
So I generally think of it as three sections. You have the first section, which is mostly Minnesota, but there's like from the headwaters up in north central Minnesota all the way to, I guess you could call it Minneapolis, which is only one state, but that has most of, I want to say it's the largest section of the Mississippi within it. And it's like super pristine North Woods. I saw a black bear paddling, swimming across the river right next to me. Like, North Woods, pristine wilderness. And it's cool. It starts off as like a tiny little creek. I could barely fit the width of my canoe in this creek, like standing up, looking over wild rice growing everywhere, trying to find the direction of the Mississippi. And so after that, once it gets to Minneapolis, you get into like the lock and dam system. This is still kind of considered the upper Mississippi River. I want to say there's 30 some lock and dams made by the Corps of Engineers in the early 1900s. That controls the level of all of the pools in the Mississippi, all the way to St. Louis. And that's, I guess, would be like the mid Mississippi. It's like Illinois, Iowa, Missouri area. And then after St. Louis, it's all free flowing, no dams. And it just gets big and wide all the way to the Gulf of Mexico.
When you are like, you're going through these locks, right? Do people give you a weird look like, who's this dude in the canoe? Or is it is it something that happens enough to where like, okay, today we had 5 to 6 people, or this is the one guy per week that comes through here?
No, I think I mean, it depends on how long the lock master, who's the guy who runs the lock, has been there, right? But it's not very common to see a little canoe bobbing through. But I mean, yeah, these things are like massive. Think like Panama Canal. I mean, they're not that scale, but same type of system. And like big barges come through, but it's easy enough. And it's like a government a government way. It's like a road. So any passenger at any time of day has right of way through that lock. They have to open it up for you. Any watercraft. And yeah, you get strange looks, but that's part of the fun of it on doing these trips. I mean, yeah, going through the lock, paddling next to the barges, like when you tell people that you're headed to the Gulf of Mexico and you're in Iowa and they look at you like, you don't know what you're talking about. And you're like, yeah, see you in 60 days.
So what does your canoe look like? Is it some sort of like, easy, you bought it at Walmart type thing, or is this like the Ferrari of canoes?
Well, a little bit of both. I started out in not a Walmart, but it's just a old town. It was an old town Penobscot, which is just a classic, tried and true old town canoe. Nothing special about it. I think I bought it for $400 like 6 years or 5 years earlier. And I started out the trip in that boat and not knowing anything, man. I had so much, which was part of the fun about it, is I had so much random gear and crap loaded into that boat when I first started. And you figure it out as you go, and I ditched gear and kind of adjusted as I went. But funny enough, when I was in Winona, Minnesota, just so happened that the owner of Winona Canoe Factory happened to be having a sale. It's a long serendipitous story, but it's common on these river trips I've found. So I randomly run into a guy. He ends up putting me up for a few days in Winona, Minnesota. It just so happens that the Winona Canoe Factory is having a sale, a factory blemish sale. So like a sale on imperfections at their factory. They're like a world-renowned canoe maker. The guy I was staying with knows the owner of Winona Canoe Factory. So he introduces me to him at this sale. And basically the guy and I talk. He tells me to come back the next day, gives me like a big 2-hour tour of the factory. We sit down, chop it up, and then basically I walk away with a brand new Winona boat, which was basically the Ferrari of canoes. And I always remember the thing he said. He was like, when I first started talking to him, I was like, "What?" He's like, "What kind of boat are you paddling?" And of course, I'm in Winona, Minnesota, at the Winona Canoe Factory, and I'm like, I'm paddling an old town Penobscot. And he kind of shakes his head and thinks a little bit. And he's like, yeah, it's a fine boat, but he's like, we need to get you something faster. And what he said was, he's like, okay, if you're going to ride across the country on a bike, just for instance, you wouldn't take a mountain bike or a fat tire winter bike. It's like you take a road bike, you take a finely tuned road bike and just crush out miles. And he's like, you're riding like a fat tire bike. You need something a little faster. And so, yeah, he hooked me up with a brand new boat that I thought was kind of cool, at least. And I wrote him a letter afterwards that I can't imagine there's another boat that's made at the Winona Canoe Factory has never touched the road. It was literally like paddled onto the river and then made it all the way to saltwater at the Gulf of Mexico.
After years of fine print contracts and getting ripped off by big wireless providers, if we've learned anything, it's that there's always a catch. So when I first heard that Mint Mobile offers premium wireless starting at just $15 a month, I thought, what's the catch? But after talking to them and using their service, it all made sense. There isn't one. Mint Mobile's secret sauce is that they're the first company to sell wireless service online only. They cut out the cost of retail stores and pass those sweet savings directly to you. For anyone who hates their phone bill, Mint Mobile offers premium wireless for just $15 a month. I was hesitant about having to get a new phone and a new phone number, but with Mint, You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and keep your same phone and your same phone number along with all of your existing contacts. Mint Mobile gives you the best rate whether you're buying for one or for a family, and at Mint, families start at 2 lines. All plans come with unlimited talk and text plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Switch to Mint Mobile and get premium wireless service starting at just $15 a month. To get your new wireless plan for just $15 a month and to get the plan shipped to your door for free, go to mintmobile.com/waypoint. That is mintmobile.com/waypoint. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/waypoint.
Wow, that's pretty crazy. So is that the one that you took on the Yukon?
So funny enough, after completing that was a solo boat. I actually picked up the Old Town. I left the Old Town with the guy in Minnesota who was putting me up. He used it for a couple of trips with him and his kid, and then like a year later, I picked it up from him and took that one up to the Yukon, which is what I did the Yukon with my buddy Jackson.
Nice. So talk to me about that one, because that was pre-COVID. The logistical things about travel were a lot easier back then, which wasn't even that long ago, but kind of like a lifetime ago, it seems like. So how did you plan that out? Because you're in a different country and you have long swaths of territory where there's not really going to be a whole lot there. You're not probably sure about arrival times, things like that. So how did you plan such a huge journey with such little in between?
Well, part of the glorious part of both those trips is that there is a lot of planning that goes into it, but there's also just a lot of like, we don't know, we'll figure it out, the main logistics that we had taken care of. I'll put it this way. We didn't know much about the river. At first we were going to paddle the Mackenzie River, which is the longest river of Canada, flows up to the Arctic Ocean. And in doing our research, we called some outfitter, and he was like, "Yeah, the Mackenzie, that'd be a fine trip for a thing like you're doing. But have you ever heard of the Yukon?" Like, no, not really. He's like, "Check out the Yukon." He's like, "I think that might be a better trip." We're like, "Okay, cool." He's like, "It's pretty muddy up here," and we're like, "Cool." So we looked at the Yukon, and then started we were blown away. With the Yukon, there really wasn't that much out there. There is one guidebook, a guy who I'd like to get on the podcast. I actually just sent an email, and you should have on your podcast as well. Dan McLean, I believe is his name. He's got a book called Paddling the Yukon River and Its Tributaries. And it's kind of a bare bones guidebook to paddling the Yukon and its tributaries, which would be the Tanana, the Porcupine, the Kayakuk, a couple other of the main ones. The Teslin, I believe, might be on there. And so he has some bare bones background stuff in there. And then we had a couple people, my buddy Jackson had some friends in Alaska who kind of had a better understanding of which towns and villages you might be able to get a resupply in and which ones are kind of just bare bones, not much. And so we started off with a bunch of food with us in Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory, which is where the river starts. And then we had a resupply in Fort Yukon, which we mailed to the post office in Fort Yukon and just wrote for pickup by canoeist and hoped that the packages would get there. They did, and they held them for us. It worked great. But we did one in Fort Yukon, and then we did one resupply that we mailed to ourselves. Same thing to the post office in Galena.
Nice. So what are you taking with you? You got fuel, you got a Coleman, burner. Do you have MSR pocket rocket? What are you taking to cook food? How much dishes type stuff are you going? Filter, water bottles, boiling. What are those sort of things?
So we had one or two whisper lights. I think we had one whisper light, and we ended up cooking most of our food on open fire. Part of that was because early in the trip, Jackson ended up picking up a dirty fuel that wasn't quite clean enough to burn through the whisper light in Canada. Those Canadian folk, it's a little different over there,
Yeah.
And So we cooked mostly on the open fire, but we did have a whisper light for boiling stuff and doing whatever we needed to do. Um, Water, we were mostly drinking from, or pretty much exclusively drinking from tributaries that would come into the Yukon. We'd find like a clean running stream running into the river because, as you might know, the Yukon's like a big, dirty, slow rolling kind of dirty, mucky, silty river. So we would, stop at creeks or tributaries as they flowed in and fill up with like a 5 gallon jug of water and hope that that lasted us till the next tributary. Sometimes it didn't. And looking back on it, that was the one of the bigger like nuts and bolts things that I would have done differently is we didn't settle any water. We were just, going for clean water from the tributaries coming in. But if I were to do it again, I would, bring some sort of a bucket or some sort of a settling system just to let that silt settle out and still be able to pump the stuff from the Yukon or boil or drink.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were some times where had some long stretches where we didn't really have that much fresh water coming in, and we just kind of dealt with it.
I have some friends who have been up there, and sometimes the river gets so big and so wide, like there are islands in the river that you can camp on. And there are times when you just don't have to row at all. And so it was almost boring because you just kind of go along at a few miles an hour and there's really not a whole lot to do. So how did you pass those hours? And were there times where you thought, oh my gosh, this is going to take forever? Or was it just so much fun and beautiful that you didn't even really care?
Personally, and it's always rosier looking back, right? This was in 2018, but it was amazing. No, I loved it. I loved every second of it, and I long for those extended trips all the time. And as far as the canoe trips, we do a little bit of floating, but for the most part, it's wake up on this Yukon trip in particular. Like the general schedule would be wake up, make a couple cups of coffee, sit around, maybe make a little fire in the morning, sit around, drink coffee, make breakfast, pack up camp, get on the water. And then basically we're paddling all day and we are canoeing, we're rowing and paddling and trying to make miles. For the most part, if we see something interesting, we're not hesitant to stop and check it out by any means. But we're paddling and staying active. And I love to canoe. It's one of my favorite things to do, just to see new things on the river. I love the way the boat moves in the water. I think there's something about the way a canoe, can maneuver in moving water. It's just like poetic in my mind. It's like skiing powder or something like that. And yeah, I don't get bored with it. I love it. So yeah, we would wake up, paddle all day, find a good spot for camp, set up camp, make a fire, cook, relax, play some Yahtzee or something, go to bed and repeat.
Mm-hmm. You had to have forgotten something. What'd you forget?
Oh, let's see. I don't know. I think honestly, I think on both of them, it was probably the opposite. We brought too much. On the Mississippi, for instance, I brought way too much when I started. I had like part of it was because it was like, okay, I'm paddling. I expect it to take like 3 to 4 months. What do I need for 3 to 4 months? How much can I take in my canoe? I didn't really have a whole much to go off of. I was just kind of trying to figure it out, and I brought all kinds of stupid stuff. I had like 2 cast iron frying pans, a cutting board. I had a full blown acoustic guitar. I had like uh, you know all kinds of odds and ends stuff that I ended up like giving to people as I progressed throughout the river. And of course, on the Mississippi, the early sections of the river in Minnesota, where I was heaviest and had most of my stuff, is when you have all kinds of portages. There's beaver dams and actual like hydrological dams for water power and such that you have to portage around in that early section. So there's like 30 or 35 portages where I'm lugging all this stuff before I finally whittled it down and kind of got it dialed in. But by the time the Yukon came, I think we had it pretty well figured out what we needed.
When you're on those longer trips, what's the difference between like your small group, it's just you and another person on the Yukon, massive amounts of time with them, versus yourself where you can just make any sort of decision you want, but you don't have anybody else there, versus, the one person you have to run stuff by, versus a larger group like you had on the Grand Canyon. Does it matter based on the river? Does it matter who's with you? Does your attitude, or how does the dynamic change based on how many people are with you?
Great question. And I think all of the above. There's pluses and minuses to everything, but it all comes down to if you can share it with good people, I think it's probably best to do that. But I love traveling alone for those reasons that you said. I did the Mississippi alone because I couldn't find anybody else to go, float for 4 months with me. And luckily I was able to convince my buddy Jackson to do the Yukon after telling him stories about the Mississippi. He had enough like wanderlust that he was like, all right, sign me up. But that there's absolute beauty in being able to just beat to your own drum when you're doing a solo trip. You want to stop, you're hungry, stop and eat. You want to sleep, you want to sleep in, sleep in. You want to check out a little town because you have an inkling that there might be a good burger and a beer, go check it out. All of those things are awesome. And I think when you get with more people, I think there's definitely something to sharing the experience with someone, right? I had plenty of human interactions and stories that I shared people with, but not that I am friends with. It's like a kind of a one-off interaction. Whereas when you're with other people, people make the trip as long as, they have a positive attitude and your goals are relatively aligned. It can be easy on some of those trips to have like different groups of people, either somebody who really wants to make miles and like treat it like a fitness deal, which is great. And then there's other people who want to take it slow and check out every nook and cranny. So I think figuring out some of that stuff and just setting goals when you're with bigger people on those trips can be valuable.
Mm-hmm. And then what happens when you get back? Because I know that I've spent the summers in Alaska. I taught in California for a couple of years, and I'd come home as soon as the school year was over. And back in Klawock, population 650, 700 people, and it was just quiet and it was slow. And then I get back to California, and I just feel like everything is so overwhelmed. I think, what is wrong with all of you and all of your activity and all of this filth and all of this action? And I didn't feel like that, the energy that people talk about when they go to a big city and they just love the energy. And, I felt that. You go to New York, you think, oh man, this is pretty sweet. Are you talking about the history in Boston? So there can be a cool part to it, but for the most part, it's pretty jarring when you get back to the real world. So how is that reintroduction to your life? Do you find yourself falling back into old, bad, wasteful habits? Are you happy to be back? Do you can't wait to get to a Chick-fil-A or get a burger, or what's that like?
Again, I think it's kind of all of those wrapped up in one. It can be hard, but for me, at least on the two big trips, usually on smaller trips, because we're talking about all the big trips that I've done, but I love being outside. So I go out, for a weekend, for a night, whenever I can. And it seems like on those, I'm always like longing for it to be longer and to be out in the woods more rather than, whatever it is, go back to work or whatever. But on those longer trips, I was ready to be wrapped up. But also knowing in the back of my mind, it's an odd, double-edged sword, I guess, because I was ready to be wrapped up. I'd been out there for long enough, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, I know in like 3 or 4 months, after sitting still for a little bit, I'm going to be just wishing I was right back out here. And that was one of the things that I tried to not help, but like to tell Jackson about who I was going on the Yukon, because he was leaning on me for some of the insights, having just come off the Mississippi trip, like what to expect, stuff like that. And it's like, dude, just take it in. It's easy to rush through it, but there's no need to rush. Like you're going to wish you were back here. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of that. And then, yeah, getting back to it, it's like, it's always tricky. I try and be, I try and be not direct, but what's the word? I try and be thoughtful about how I can bring some of the things that I've learned on these trips back to like quote unquote front country life, or however you want to say it. And so I try and think about those things like, being open, being kind to people. Like it's easy to get in your ruts, but when I'm on the river, like if I stop off at a town, a random town for a beer or a burger, or just sitting at a local park, like if someone walks up, like, hey, I'll talk to them. Like I'm interested in getting their story. I'm a little more open and kind and not judging so much of people. It's easy to, once you get in your ways, to be judging. So I try and think back to those things, and I try and take those things, you know, in stride. But yeah, you get in a ruts, and then I guess that just means it's time for another trip, maybe.
So in closing here, give me a pitch for someone who maybe doesn't want to take the time to go on a longer type trip. What would be the benefits? What's either for them to do it themselves, or what would be the pitch of joining you on one of your adventures?
Absolutely. So a couple pitches. One, the one that stuck with me is that if you have any inclining in your gut that tells you that you should go and do one of these long trips, you got to go do it. That was what it was for me. It was like I just knew in my gut like I wanted to go out there and kind of test myself and uh, you know totally immerse myself, because there's like lengths of time where you can if you're out there for multiple months or a month at a time, it's like the stuff melts away after, like, for me at least, after like a week. The outside world kind of melts away. It's like, hey, I'm in the middle of Alaska. If shit goes down, I can't do anything about it, so I'm floating for the next month. And it's a beautiful mind state to be in. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good pitch, but it's I get so much mental clarity from it. It gives you a perspective to look at your life and take a step back and breathe a little bit and think about things on a deeper level without having to go through all of the maybe typical minutia. And yeah, I heard a guy talking about one of the long trips he did, and this was before I'd done the Mississippi, and I kind of went up and talked to him afterwards, and I remember him looking at me and he's like, I could tell. It's like, you want to do it. It's in your gut. You got to go do it. Now, and that was like a decision point for me. It's like, wow, I didn't even realize that I was emitting this much passion about it. Like I was just talking to this guy about it, and he was like, I can tell you need to do it. So that was kind of my pull. That's the only reason that I would maybe suggest doing something like that, is if you're called to do it, I guess. And as far as coming on me with a trip, yeah, I do hosted and guided wilderness trips. I have one going up to the Yukon this summer with a small group of people. It's going to be 6 of us. It's going to be a blast. And on those trips, it's about a wilderness retreat. It's about seeing amazing places. It started just because I like to do these trips. Other people were contacting me, asking me, hey, how could I get involved with something like this? So I figured, hey, might as well go to the destinations that I want to go to on my own, these amazing, beautiful places, and take other people along so we can all share in an awesome trip. And I think the cool thing about canoeing is that it's such a cool way to see the world. It's different than hiking or backpacking. You're on like nature's highway. Everything around the river, like the river is life for that valley. So whatever animal, whatever wildlife, they're all going to gravitate to the water. So it's a great place to be as far as getting a pulse of whatever nature you may be in.
When are you going on that Yukon one?
The Yukon one is the end of July, the final week of July.
Okay. I'll be up there the 26th or something like that for a caribou hunt. Buddy and I are going to go up there and do the Hall Road, get up to the Brooks Range. So that'll be pretty fun. So
Awesome, man. I'm excited, and I've enjoyed listening to some of your podcasts and reading some of your stuff. I've been reading some of your stuff in the paper, in the Juneau Express. Is that right?
Empire.
Juneau Empire. Yeah, I went to the woods. I've been liking, kind of reading some of your stuff. So
Thanks, I
yeah,
appreciate that.
keep on, man.
Yeah. So where can people find you? I know you have website. I was kind of browsing through some of your daily notes from the Yukon trip. Was pretty sweet. So where can people find you, follow, and all that?
Yeah, the best place is buffaloroamer.com. Definitely subscribe and check out the podcast. Buffalo Roamer Outdoors is the podcast. Again, Buffalo Roamer Outdoors. Check it out, listen, subscribe. BuffaloRoamer.com, and then on social media at Buffalo Roamer. Not as active on there as I should be, but oftentimes just too busy fishing.
That's good. That's good. Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate you being on here. It's great to talk to new people. One of the cool things about the podcast is being able to connect. I think we talked about that when I was on your podcast. Great to get these new ideas and new ways of looking at life and finding friends across the country.
Absolutely, man. It's great, and it's great to be able to talk about things that we're passionate about.
Cool, man. Take care.
Thank you much.